The conversation was brought to a close by a declaration on the part of the Empress that were she to fall into the Seine with her son, as the Emperor had said, she would not hesitate one moment about leaving. A wish so formally expressed as that of her husband was a sacred command to her. Napoleon has since complained that his order was too strictly interpreted. He has said that the execution of this order was subordinated to circumstances which had changed since the day on which he'd given it. There can be no doubt that the Empress's presence in Paris might have checkmated guilty maneuvers and have given Napoleon time to arrive to the rescue of his capital by preceding the enemy there. The Privy Council had felt this. The Empress and her counselors understood it, but who would have dared to disobey the formal instructions which we have recorded? Moreover, the subsequent letters of the Emperor during the fortnight which had elapsed between the time when they were given and the day on which they were carried out had neither canceled nor modified these orders. The treasure and the most valuable things were loaded upon vans which were to follow the Empress's escort. I sent for the archivist attached to the Emperor's cabinet and named to him, according to instructions which I had received, the most important papers which Napoleon had not taken away with him, so that they might be burned. This order was only partially carried out, and the government of the Restoration found a sufficiently large number of papers which ought to have been destroyed. I carried away with me family papers and letters to preserve them until they were in danger of being taken, in which case I was to destroy them. I then withdrew to my dwelling, where I made my arrangements for following the Empress with my family on the following day. It had been agreed that King Joseph should proceed to the outpost to acquaint himself personally with the situation of the Marshals Marmont and Mortier, and that the Empress should await his return before taking her departure. The departure had been fixed for the morrow, March 29th, at 8 o'clock in the morning. The carriages with horses put to were waiting in the carousel courtyard. The Empress, dressed and ready to go, had been in her apartments with her son and the ladies in waiting since 7 in the morning. Distracted and with her mind full of sorrowful presentiments, she evaded the questions of her son, whose happy carelessness was disturbed by this unusual movement. Already at the break of day, the drawing rooms had filled with people who had been appointed to follow the sovereign. A painful silence had succeeded the noisy conversations which had at first been exchanged on the subject of what was the object of general solicitude. But the anxiety was nonetheless great. A sudden noise, the opening of a door, was sufficient to agitate everybody present. We were expecting to see King Joseph, who had proceeded to the gates of Paris before daybreak, or at least somebody sent by him. Suddenly the officers of the National Guard on service at the Tuileries, together with their other officers, entered precipitously, and gaining access to the Empress, implored her not to leave Paris and promised to defend her. Marie-Louise, touched to tears by their devotion, told them of the Emperor's orders. She, however, delayed her departure hour by hour and sought to gain time, feeling that her departure would be a public disaster. She hoped, without daring to admit it, that some fortuitous occurrence would prevent it. Clark, the Minister of War, who the previous evening had insisted on the necessity of the Empress's departure, had sent an officer in the morning to point out to the Empress how urgent it was that she should start. Pressed by some to hasten away and by others, on the contrary, to remain, Marie-Louise was a prey to extreme agitation. She once re-entered her bedroom, threw her hat on the bed in a temper, and sat down on an easy chair. There, resting her head on her hands, she began to cry. In the midst of her complaints, broken with tears, she was heard to repeat with impatience, "My God, let them make up their minds and put an end to this agony." At last, towards 10 o'clock, the Minister of War sent word to her that there was not a moment to lose, and that if she tarried any longer, she would expose herself to falling into the hands of the Cossacks. The Empress, receiving no message from King Joseph, then decided to leave. When the time had come to enter the carriages, the young King of Rome refused to leave his apartment. The poor child seemed to guess what the future reserved for him. "Don't go to Rambouillet," he cried out to his mother. "It's a nasty place. Let us stop here." he struggled in the arms of Monsieur de Canissy, the equerry, who was carrying him, saying, "I don't want to leave my house." Such was the expression that he kept repeating, "I don't want to go away, since Papa is absent. It is I who am the master." He clung to the doors and to the balustrade on the staircase. This obstinacy on his part excited a painful astonishment in the minds of all who witnessed this sorrowful scene, and awoke I know not what sad and gloomy presentiments. The carriages drove out slowly, and as though a counter-order was hoped for, by the Pont Royal gate. 10 heavy green berlines with the imperial arms painted on the panels of the doors. A crowd of carriages, baggages, and vans formed a line which stretched right across the courtyard. 60 or 80 sightseers contemplated this sorrowful procession in a gloomy silence, as though they had been looking at a funeral procession. They were indeed present at the funeral of the empire. Their feelings were manifested in no way. Not a voice raised itself to salute with an expression of regret the bitterness of this cruel separation. If somebody had had the inspiration to cut the traces of the carriages, the Empress would not have left. She passed out through the gateway of the Tuileries courtyard with tears in her eyes and death in her soul. On arriving at the Champs-Élysées, she saluted the imperial city, which she was leaving behind for a last time, and bade it farewell forever. The danger which threatened the capital had aroused great agitation in Paris. The general alarm had been beaten all night. The National Guard was assembling at full speed. Some battalions of volunteers, with some artillery saved by the brave soldiers of the Polytechnic School, who paid their debt to the country before their time, marched out to support the corps of Marshal Dukes de Ragusa and de Trevisa. Others collected at the barriers of Paris to defend the entrance to the city. All emulated in zeal and harmed the enemy sufficiently to oblige it to call up its reserve forces. The population of the Faubourg was filled with ardor and clamored for arms, but arms and ammunition were alike wanting. The news of the transfer of the government of the Regency to the provinces took Paris by surprise. In the midst of this agitation, the hatred of the foreigners and the imminence of the danger to which the city was exposed prevented the disorders which the absence of the government and of all force able to repress them would have occasioned. On March 29th, at daybreak, a regiment of the Prussian vanguard, the Scouts of Europe under arms, appeared under the walls of the capital of France, which a handful of its brave children attempted, though in vain, to defend against too numerous enemies. The emperor and the bulk of his army were far away. No news had been received of them since 9 days. The city of Paris would have needed on such a day a Camillus, or the heroism of a senate, like the senate whose Majesty Brennus long ago was able to contemplate in the capital. In the meanwhile, King Joseph was with the Minister of War, of the Administration of War, and of Marine. Outside the barriers, it was there that they learned from the engineer of the Paris Fire Brigade, who had been made a prisoner in the morning, that almost the entire Allied forces were under the walls of Paris. The officer, having been conducted before the Emperor of Russia, the King of Prussia, and Prince Schwarzenberg, had been sent back to the outposts. He had been reported that he had seen to Marshal Marmont, who had sent him on to King Joseph. It was not long, moreover, before the Duc de Ragusa warned the prince of the danger of his position, which would not allow him to resist more than a few hours. He asked to be allowed to conclude an arrangement with the enemy, the French troops not being in a position to prevent the occupation by force, the occupation with which Paris was perhaps menaced during the night. King Joseph and the ministers recognized that resistance was impossible, and that Paris was exposed to be carried, so to speak, by storm. General Hulin was sent to Marshal Marmont with authority to treat, for the urgency of the matter began to be felt. Indeed, the columns of the enemy were already appearing in the plain and began to overwhelm the feeble forces of the two marshals. They were maneuvering in the direction of Saint-Denis, approaching the bridges of which they took possession only a few minutes after King Joseph and the ministers had crossed them. The latter had nothing left for them to do than to follow the Empress and the Regency Council in conformity with their instructions. King Joseph had promised the citizens of Paris to remain with them. He had kept his promise. He His place was not within the city walls, but at the gates where the danger lay. Whilst there was the faintest hope of defending Paris, he did not give up the struggle. When after a heroic resistance, Marshals Mardier and Marmont declared that they could hold out no longer, it became the king's duty to save the capital from the horrors of an occupation by force. He authorized the marshals to retreat. His presence in Paris could be of no use whatever. After the departure of the Empress and the King of Rome, he had done to prevent this departure what his conscience and his honor allowed him to do. He had shown himself a good citizen as well as the Emperor's devoted brother. If King Joseph had remained any longer in Paris, what just reproaches would he not have merited from his contemporaries and from history? He would have remained there, but to become in the hands of the Allied powers, the instrument of his brother's dethronement, an odious role, which he could not have accepted, and which would have been imposed upon him by his desire to defend the interests of his nephew. In one word, as long as Joseph Bonaparte preserved the hope of being of any use, he remained. When this last hope vanished, he departed, but he departed the last of all. The Empress Marie-Louise, who had left the Tuileries on March 29th towards midday, was sadly making her way towards Rambouillet. We had a vague idea that we might stop at this palace. Although this hope was not authorized by any plausible motive, the suite of the fugitive sovereign was composed of the Duchess de Montebello, Lady of Honor, Countess de Luce, Mistress of the Wardrobe, Madame de Castiglione, Brioni, Montalivet, Ladies of the Palace, Count Beauharnais, Knight of Honor, Messieurs de Gontaut, and Dausenville, Chamberlains, Prince Aldobrandini, First Equerry, Messieurs Irissi, and Liberty, Equerries and de Coucy and Bausset, prefects of the palace, de Seyssel, master of ceremonies, and de Guercy, quartermaster of the palace. And finally, Messieurs Corvisart, Boudier, Lacunay, and Royer, who formed the medical staff in attendance. The King of Rome was accompanied by the Countess de Montesquieu, his governess, Mesdames de Boubert, and Miss Grigny, under governesses, Monsieur de Canissy, Equerry, and by Monsieur Auvity, doctor. The Prince Arch-Chancellor and the great officer of the crown who happened to be in Paris followed the Empress. An escort of about 1,200 men composed of grenadiers, chasseurs, dragoons, and lancers of the Imperial Guard and picked gendarmes accompanied the carriages. The Empress arrived at Rambouillet at the same day, March 29th, and left it on the morrow to sleep at Chartres, without having received any news from Paris. The prefect was absent. Marie-Louise passed the night at the prefect's house. She was very impatient to receive news of the emperor. Kings Joseph and Jerome, with their queens, the ministers of war, of the administration of war, and of marine, arrived in Chartres during the night. They had all left Paris at 5 o'clock in the morning. There was no direct news from Napoleon, except that it was heard that General Tijan, one of his aides-de-camp, had arrived sent by him to announce his march on Paris. We also heard of the proposals which had been made to the Emperor of Austria, proposals which seemed of a nature to remove every obstacle towards the conclusion of peace, to conform himself to the instructions notified by General Tijan to Marshal Mortier. This marshal had sent to Prince Schwarzenberg to ask for a peace, basing himself on the fact that negotiations had been commenced with the Emperor of Austria. But the Austrian commander-in-chief had answered that he had no knowledge of this fact and had refused a suspension of arms, having already concluded with Marshal Marmont a covenant for the surrender of Paris. We also heard that the prefect of the Senate and the prefect of police had alone remained in the capital. Prince de Benevento Talleyrand, desires of being prepared for any event, had asked the Minister of Police for authorization to remain in Paris on the pretext that he might be useful there. Although it could easily be seen what part he was playing, the authorities were no longer powerful enough to force him to follow the government to Blois. He was accordingly told that there were no orders to be given him. This opinion not shielding him sufficiently to his way of thinking, Mr. de Talleyrand, wishing to make everything straight, left his hotel with a certain amount of display and pretended to be on his way to join the Empress, but took care to get himself arrested at the gates of Paris. Having thus put appearances on his side, Prince de Benevento returned home to await events. Queen Hortense had returned to Navarre with the Empress Josephine. Such was the news we received at Chartres. Our original intention was to travel to Tours, but in Vendôme, the Empress received a letter from the Emperor, which was forwarded by King Joseph. In this letter, Napoleon announced his arrival at Court de France on March 30th. We had heard the news of the capitulation of Paris. This letter contained the order that the Empress was to go to Blois. At the same time, we heard in Vendôme that the Allied troops with the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia at their head had just entered Paris, and that the Prince de Benevento was presiding at the Senate. The Empress arrived in the evening of April 2nd at Blois and was received by the prefect, Baron Christiani. She established herself at the prefecture mansion. It was there that the ministers and various councillors of state who had already proceeded to Tours joined the Empress. This princess stayed at Blois until April 8th, and it was here that we learned the succession of events which had happened in Paris since the departure of the Regency government. Marshal Marmont, taking advantage of the authorization with which he had been awarded by King Joseph, had sent one of his officers to Prince Schwarzenberg to treat on the capitulation with the Allies, and it was in virtue of this capitulation that the Allied sovereigns, except the Emperor of Austria, had entered Paris on March 31st, preceded by the Russian and Prussian corps. The Emperor Alexander personally had not much liking for the Bourbons. The King of Prussia had identified himself both in his language and attitude with the Emperor of Russia. Prince Schwarzenberg, in the absence of the Emperor of Austria and his principal minister, remained undecided. The Emperor Alexander had established himself at the Talleyrand mansion in the Rue Saint-Florentin, where he had been preceded by his minister, Nesselrode. The Russian sovereign was there surrounded by people who persuaded him that the French nation entirely rejected Napoleon. The principal object of the discussions which were entered upon bore on the troubled question of knowing whether the emperor should be retained, whether a regency should be declared, or whether the Bourbons should be recalled. Talleyrand, now already deeply compromised, seeing that the emperor's cause was lost, had thrown off the mask, presenting Duke d'Alberg, Abbés Louis and Prat, General de Soult, and some others as organs of public opinion. He had decided the two emperors to declare that the Allies would no longer treat with Napoleon. Prince Schwarzenberg maintained a silence which caused some anxiety to Talleyrand and his accomplices. At last, not wishing to take upon himself the responsibility of a refusal, the Austrian commander-in-chief yielded and took the same engagement in the name of his sovereign. The renegade faction, encouraged by this adhesion, added to the declaration by which the Allies forbade themselves to treat with Emperor Napoleon the words, "nor with any member of his family." If one could doubt that the restoration was the work of foreigners, it would suffice to remember that the Allied sovereigns would only permit the publication of the document which are called Louis XVIII to the throne of France when they found themselves free from all fear and able to dispense with considerations of every kind by the desertion, the commander of the Third Corps.